Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a story you may have only heard in passing, if at all. You've probably heard about Tulsa, Oklahoma, the massacre in 1921 that burned Black Wall Street to the ground. But what if I told you Tulsa wasn't an exception? It was part of a pattern. That's right, Tulsa was just the tip of the iceberg. This video is about a recurring and calculated strategy, one that used violence not just to destroy buildings, but to erase futures, erase communities, erase Black prosperity from the American landscape. Let's begin with Tulsa. In 1921, the destruction of Black Wall Street wasn't just a riot, it was a targeted act of racial violence and economic erasure. Over 18 hours, one of the most prosperous Black communities in the country was reduced to ash. Hundreds killed, thousands displaced, and millions of dollars in generational wealth gone overnight. But Tulsa wasn't alone. Just south in Florida, entire towns like Rosewood and Ocoee faced similar horrors. Their Black residents weren't just attacked, they were systematically removed. Their homes and businesses razed, their land seized, their stories buried. You see, these weren't isolated outbursts of hate. They were symptoms of a larger disease, a national pattern, a playbook, even. So why were these towns, peaceful, successful Black communities, so dangerous in the eyes of white supremacist systems? Because they challenged the existing order. They thrived, and in doing so, they defied the myth that Black people couldn't prosper on their own. They disrupted the racial hierarchy, they threatened political control and economic dominance, so they were eliminated. This is where our story begins. But trust me, it goes much deeper. Let's move to the next chapter, what these communities actually looked like before they were torn apart. Before the fire, before the mobs, before the silence, there were communities that thrived, Black communities, built from the ground up, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, against every imaginable odd. Let's start in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black Wall Street. Now, this wasn't some small enclave, it was a powerhouse. 10,000 residents, over 600 Black-owned businesses. We're talking movie theaters, barbershops, hotels, law firms, grocery stores, doctors' offices, and yes, banks. That's how deep the prosperity ran. Imagine an entire ecosystem of success, fueled by ownership, cooperation, and vision. And yet, it's been almost wiped from our collective memory. Then there's Rosewood, Florida. This wasn't just a town, it was a statement. Rosewood was a self-reliant Black community. The residents owned their homes, ran their own stores, worshipped in their own churches, and educated their children in their own school. It was a symbol of dignity and independence. And that's precisely what made it dangerous in the eyes of those who couldn't stand to see it flourish. And let's not forget Ocoee, Florida, a place where Black farmers not only owned their land, but were politically active. They organized, they voted, they were participating in the system, demanding a seat at the table, and doing so successfully. Until, of course, the backlash came. Violent, swift, and final. These towns weren't just surviving in a hostile world, they were succeeding. But success, when it disrupts power, often becomes a target. Next, we'll explore exactly why these communities were seen as threats and what systems fueled their destruction. So, why did these communities become targets? What was so dangerous about a thriving neighborhood, about children going to school, families owning land, businesses opening their doors? To answer that, we have to look beneath the surface, at the systems of fear, control, and resentment that shaped the response to Black success. First, decentralized Black prosperity. These communities weren't relying on outside help. They weren't dependent on the state or white institutions. They built parallel economies, self-sustaining, efficient, and proud. That kind of independence disrupted the racial order. It made a lie of the myth that Black people couldn't succeed without white oversight. And for those clinging to power, that truth was terrifying. Next, political suppression and control. Take Ocoee, for example. The massacre there wasn't just about race, it was about power. A Black man tried to vote. That one act, exercising a legal right, sparked a wave of retaliatory violence. Why? Because political participation threatened the status quo. And when you threaten a system built on exclusion, that system pushes back hard. Then there's economic jealousy and resentment. As Black families gained wealth, real wealth, white neighbors looked on. Not with pride, not with curiosity, but with envy. That envy, stoked by newspapers and politicians, turned into fear. And fear turned into rage. And rage into fire. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, fueled by incentives, social, political, and economic. Coming up next, we'll dive into one of the clearest examples of this pattern in action, the Rosewood Massacre, where an entire town was erased in less than a week. Imagine this, an entire town wiped off the map in 7 days. That's what happened in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. It started with a lie. A white woman claimed she was assaulted by a black man. There was no evidence, but evidence wasn't needed. All it took was the accusation. Within hours, white mobs descended on Rosewood like a storm, armed, organized, and ready to destroy. Homes were burned, businesses looted, churches torched, families scattered, and the violence didn't stop with the fire. What came next was silence. A deep, official silence. There were no arrests, no trials, no compensation, no justice. Despite deaths, destruction, and clear evidence of criminal behavior, not a single person was held accountable. It wasn't justice denied, it was justice intentionally buried. And those who survived? They never came back. Their land? Taken, without payment, without recourse. That land was absorbed into surrounding communities, often resold. Generational wealth vanished. Forever. The message was clear: you can build your own town, you can build your own success, but if you step out of line, if you disrupt the order, we will erase you. And no one will stop it. And no one did. But Rosewood wasn't alone. Next, we head to Ocoee, Florida, where something as simple as casting a vote was enough to unleash a massacre. Let's rewind to November 2nd, 1920, Election Day. A black man named Mose Norman walked into a polling station in Ocoee, Florida, with a simple goal: to vote. He was educated, he owned land, he paid taxes, and legally, he had the right to cast his ballot. But he was turned away. So, like any determined citizen, he came back, reportedly with a shotgun, demanding his constitutional right. That moment, one man insisting on his rights, was all it took to set off an explosion. That night, white mobs swept through Ocoee. They burned homes. They lynched men. They shot at families trying to flee. Entire blocks of black-owned property went up in flames. Within hours, the black population of Ocoee, once more than 500 people, was driven out. Some fled into the woods and never returned. And here's the chilling part. Ocoee remained all white for decades after. Not by coincidence. By design. This wasn't just about violence. It was about erasure. Total removal. And again, no convictions. No investigations. Just silence. Think about that. A man tried to vote, and an entire community paid the price. This wasn't random. It was systemic. It was a signal. If you seek power, if you challenge the hierarchy, the system will fight back, and it will fight dirty. But what happens when the people meant to uphold justice are the ones allowing, or even participating in, the destruction? That's where we go next. When the state itself fails, or chooses to look the other way. Here's the question that keeps echoing through every one of these tragedies. Where was the state? Where were the sheriffs, the prosecutors, the governors, the people whose job it was to uphold law and order? Too often, they were either looking the other way or lighting the match. Let's be clear, these massacres didn't happen in a vacuum. In Rosewood, in Ocoee, in Tulsa, local governments and law enforcement weren't just absent. In many cases, they were involved. Deputies stood by. Officials refused to investigate. In some instances, police were in the mob. This wasn't just moral failure. It was structural. These systems weren't built to protect everyone equally. They were built to protect power. And when the power of white supremacy was challenged by black prosperity or political participation, the state didn't intervene. It reinforced the status quo. And here's the kicker: there were no consequences. Not for the perpetrators. Not for the institutions that failed to act. In fact, many of those who committed these acts kept their land, their jobs, their status. Meanwhile, survivors, displaced, traumatized, were told to move on, to rebuild from nothing, with no restitution, no legal path, and no acknowledgement of what had been done. So what does that tell us? It tells us that when a system has no incentive to protect the vulnerable, when violence is met with silence or reward, then erasure isn't a glitch. It's the plan. Up next, we'll look at the long-term cost of this kind of violence. Not just the lives lost, but the futures stolen. The wealth, the memory, the legacy, all gone in the smoke. Let's talk about what was really lost, because when we say these communities were erased, we're not just talking about buildings. We're talking about futures that never had the chance to happen. Entire family lines were pushed into poverty. Homes passed down through generations, gone. Businesses built over years, leveled in days. Land ownership, the bedrock of American wealth building, ripped away and never returned. And this isn't just emotional loss. It's measurable. The wealth destroyed in places like Tulsa, Rosewood, and Ocoee wasn't just symbolic, it was financial. Millions of dollars in today's value were wiped out overnight. And unlike their white counterparts, Black families had no insurance payouts, no government compensation, no legal protections. Their economic engines were destroyed, and their descendants started at a disadvantage that's still visible today. But the damage goes deeper than economics. There's the psychological toll. Imagine the trauma of seeing your neighbors killed, your church burned, your entire town vanish, and then being told to forget, to stay quiet, to move on. Generations grew up in the shadow of that silence. Many survivors never even told their children what happened. They were too afraid, too ashamed, or simply too broken. And that silence, the intentional suppression of history, creates its own kind of erasure. Because if people don't know what was taken, how can they fight to restore it? But that erasure wasn't accidental. Coming up next, we'll explore why these stories were buried, and who benefits when history gets rewritten or deleted altogether. Let's be honest. Did you learn about Rosewood in school? What about Ocoee? Or even the full story of Tulsa? Probably not. And that's not a coincidence. It's the result of deliberate, organized silence. You see, when a society wants to maintain a myth, say, the myth of equal opportunity, or the idea that America has always been fair and just, it has to hide the cracks, the bloodstains, the erased towns. So these events, they were buried, not just under rubble, but under textbooks, and silence, and shame. Survivors were threatened into silence. Local governments refused to document the massacres. Newspapers downplayed or distorted the facts. And the school system? It simply left these stories out. Why? Because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that the system isn't broken, it was built this way. It would mean asking uncomfortable questions about who got rich while others were burned out, about whose land was stolen, about why justice never came. And when you control the narrative, you control the future. If no one remembers what was taken, then no one asks for it back. If no one knows what happened, then no one sees the pattern. And if no one sees the pattern, then it keeps happening. But not everyone forgot. Historians, activists, families who refuse to be silenced. They've been piecing the truth back together, document by document, name by name, story by story. And that brings us to a deeper question. What do these stories really tell us about how systems work, and who they work for? Let's unpack that next. Let's step back for a moment and ask a bigger question. What do these erased communities actually teach us, not just about racism, but about systems? Because here's the uncomfortable truth, the destruction of places like Tulsa, Rosewood, and Ocoee wasn't just about mobs and violence. It was about how centralized systems, governments, law enforcement, courts, even the press, can align, whether intentionally or passively, to protect power and erase challenge. When all authority flows from the top, and when that top is controlled by a single group with a vested interest in staying dominant, what happens? Accountability disappears. Justice gets selective. And the people outside that circle? They become expendable. Now compare that to the communities themselves, Tulsa, Rosewood, Ocoee. These were decentralized success stories, built not by relying on state handouts or top-down directives, but by cooperation. Local businesses, mutual aid, families investing in each other. They were bottom-up societies thriving inside a top-down system, and that's what made them dangerous. Because if people can succeed without control from above, what happens to the legitimacy of those at the top? That's the question that terrifies centralized power. What if people realize they don't need them? What if prosperity, real, sustainable prosperity, comes from freedom, ownership, and local accountability, not from bureaucracy and coercion? History doesn't just tell us what happened. It warns us about what happens when systems have no checks, no balance, and no incentive to protect those they deem inconvenient. So let's close this out by imagining something different. What would a society look like if erasure wasn't possible? What would it take to build that kind of world? Let's imagine something different. What if we built a society where stories couldn't just disappear, where power couldn't burn down a neighborhood and walk away, where truth wasn't buried under silence, where success didn't provoke destruction, and history wasn't rewritten by the victors, but remembered by all? What would it take? We'd need more than just new laws. We'd need new systems, systems that distribute power, not hoard it, systems where accountability is real, where justice can't be delayed or denied, where communities own their futures, and where no one has the authority to erase a people, a legacy, or a truth. That kind of world begins with memory, with telling the truth, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And that's exactly why I wrote my book, History They Tried to Erase. It goes even deeper into the stories we covered here, and many others that have been buried even more deliberately. From the burning of Black Wall Street, to covert government experiments, to the hidden fingerprints of empire around the world. This isn't speculation. It's documented, archived, often admitted by the very agencies that tried to hide it. If you want to understand the full pattern, how these erasures happen, who benefits, and why the silence is so loud, check the link in the description. Read it as an act of resistance. Remember it as an act of justice. Share it as an act of defiance. And if this video made you think, then hit like. Leave a comment. Tell us what history you think they've tried to erase. Subscribe to Truth Behind History for more stories that challenge the official narrative and remind us that what gets remembered shapes what comes next.